George Orwell published Down and Out in Paris and London in 1933. The book was an exploration of the impact of poverty in affluent societies. I really just used the title as a cue to explore the situation in Berlin in the 21st century, and key for me here in this presentation is the importance of personal space, of, for example, accommodation for a sense of belonging.Anna Opels' novel Rot Moabit appeared in 2019. It is based on a story in the Old Testament which describes the plight of a widow who stays with her mother-in-law no matter what. In the end, she marries Boaz to protect herself, but also the mother-in-law. One of the most famous quotes is here on the slide. It says, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." The novel is based in the locality of Moabit in Berlin, that is quite in the center, and this is really neat. Moabit is probably going back, is based on the biblical reference to Moab, and it is presumably also based on what the Huguenots who were invited as refugees to Berlin in the 16th century called the area where they were allowed to settle. And it's also neat because it is here in 2015 in Turmstraße at the Landesamt für Gesundheit und Soziales that all the refugees do arrive. There are two key personalities in this novel: Rahua, who is a refugee from Eritrea, and Noemi, who lives in Berlin, in Moabit. She is working, she's a mother, she is a wife, and she's also a daughter. On arrival, one has to imagine Rahua finds herself in the same situation like the refugees arriving in Turmstraße in 2015. She finds an initial home in a mass shelter and then in due course finds accommodation with Noemi, finally her own little flat, but she has no sense of belonging. So she moves on, takes a precarious journey without papers to London, where she starts the process all over again, but this time not as an official refugee. Here she meets Boris, which the name is of course motivated by the link to the Old Testament story. And in London, in due course, she then has a child. In the final section of the novel, Rahua observes, "Jetzt erst hat Rahua ganz begriffen, dass sie Nomadin bleiben wird. Es gibt kein Zurück." So only then does she realize she will never belong. She will forever be a nomad. But London for now is the destination she has chosen. This chimes with Homi Bhabha's observations about the in-betweenness. Noemi, meanwhile, finds her life going to pieces at the very time Rahua is arriving in her flat, which has nothing to do with Rahua. Her mother dies, a very strong maternal figure. Her daughter dies in a completely unexpected accident, again a very strong figure. Her husband goes through a midlife crisis and the two of them are increasingly alienated from each other. So Noemi, hitting rock bottom, packs up and follows Rahua to London. What interests me in all this is the materialist perspective on migration and subsequently belonging. What are the everyday practices of homemaking that provide people with a sense of home. And I take my cue here from Lucinda Nunes, Domestic Intersections in Contemporary Migration Fiction, Homing the Metropole. So this is what I'm going to focus on, the particular facet when we talk about belonging, of accommodation, of being able to close one's door, of being able to cook one's favorite food, to find the ingredients, to be able to explore a degree of domesticity. There's of course a long history of the importance of a flat, a house, of accommodation and the sense of belonging to the metropolis. It is an indicator of the situation in society. It showcases particular crisis points, but also aspects such as gentrification. One example would be in the 1920s, the film Kohle Wampe, that showcases how the urban poor are driven out of the city to the allotments and have a really bare minimum life there. After the Second World War, Anna Nunas, a woman in Berlin, her record of the last days during the war, it really shows how the home becomes a cave. Civilization is going back to its very beginnings, but this cave, this shell of a house, nevertheless is her foundation and the remaining sense of security. In the 1990s, there is a boom of literature that highlights the gentrification, in particular in the east of Berlin. One example, not represented here on an image, would be Norbert Ohler's Mitte. And one could, I think, argue that in certain times this kind of literature comes to the fore actually more. I don't think it is a coincidence that at the moment the importance of accommodation, a flat, a house in the metropolis, seems to boom again. I want to just showcase two examples. Sönke Köhler's Die Entmieteten. This is really hard to translate. The verb jemanden entmieten means drive out tenants. So this here, this construction implies this is a specific group of tenants that are driven out. In this case, the tenants are GDR, former GDR tenants that with their housing block where they were so happy, which formed really their sense of being, they lose all their roots, and for most of them the development is rather dramatic. Quite a different angle, Jan Brand, Eine Wohnung in der Stadt, ein Haus auf dem Land, really done cleverly. If you turn around the book you get the other story. And A Flat in the City describes his absolutely hopeless attempt to find a flat on his own, doing the grown-up thing once he moves out of shared accommodation. Ein Haus auf dem Land, quite a different angle on the same topic. He finds out that his grandparents' house is about to be demolished. He sees the whole history in that house and nevertheless is not able to rescue the house. So a very nice juxtaposition. On the one hand, living in the countryside and not being able to maintain your inheritance, and on the other hand, the lack of belonging in the city because it's simply so complicated to find a home. So this is the background. There's a long tradition about the importance of belonging and accommodation, and I think this makes it already clear that it is not just a banality to be able to describe how you go about daily routines in a place that is your own. We have learned to associate the private with the female, the public with the male, and have worked very hard to overcome this differentiation. We associate home, and this is the quote you have in front of you, with stasis, boundaries, identity and fixity. Home is implicitly constructed as a purified space of belonging in which the subject is too comfortable to question the limit or borders of her or his experience, indeed where the subject is so at ease that she or he does not think. Instead, I would like to suggest in Rot Moabit, home is the basis to negotiate one's place in the here, now, and in the future. So it becomes really a starting point and therewith a necessity. So what do Noemi's and Rahua's homes look like? I'm going to take this in chronological order. Both have really fond memories of their childhood places. Naomi, for example, visiting her mother in West Germany, sees familiar areas. There is a real sense of a happy time in the past. However, while she is living there, she's longing for Berlin. And this is not dissimilar to Rahua, who loves her family, the courtyard where she spends a lot of time, but she longs in this courtyard for the world. When Rahua arrives in Berlin, she is initially in temporary spaces that are not hers, and this is when she's described as Rahua die Heimatlose, Rahua the one without a home. And it is only, and that's the next quote, when she moves in with Noemi and her husband Tom, and she has a room, she's able to remember Asmara, the light, the air, the smells, the music, the way people look at each other, the neighbors, and she concludes she's left everything behind to find freedom in Europe. She's got a room in Merkelland, and this is nearly triumphant. One would assume this is a success story, but interestingly, Rahua doesn't like Berlin very much. She has no sense of belonging, and this is why she moves on to the dreamscape. There are quite a number of meetings between her and other refugees, and they value places in very different ways. So her dream place is London. Everybody wanted to go there, the Garden Eden of Europe, pomegranate trees and tame squirrels. And again, she concludes this comes at a price. She leaves time and again people behind, first her family, then Naomi and the friends she made, but she can furnish herself now. On arrival in London, it starts all over again. Absolutely appalling accommodation, dreadful conditions at work. Interestingly, in the Chinese Quarter, she's working there in a restaurant. The same for Noemi when she arrives in London initially, really poor lodgings. For Naomi, the arrival allows eventually that she again furnishes her own space, her own room. She finds, for Rahua, it's a bit more complex. After she meets Boris, he facilitates that she cooks a meal. This is like a banquet. It's called the office meal, but it is all the ingredients from back home. It is the cooking she loves, and for the first time we get a sense for her of arrival. And she's able to negotiate whether she might be able to stay with him, whether that is a compromise or not. To conclude then, in Rot Moabit, belonging is defined by the ability to negotiate multiple personal spaces, being able to change them time and again, but to thereby also develop one's own personal history. Domestic space, and I have in particular the meal in mind here, then implies actually independence and is a massive step forward. In conclusion, I want to draw a parallel with a quote by Ilya Troyanov, himself a refugee. He writes, "After the first escape follows a second escape. In the beginning, the refugees get nothing of what they desired. The second escape, the second refuge, confirms their independence. And in retrospect, the second escape is so much more important. They can go away anytime again, take refuge, and thereby confirm their freedom yet again. This is a beautiful parallel with Rahua's experience. She gets to Berlin, this seems to be really what was wanted, and she gives it all up again and finds her home for some time in London. So not down and out in 21st century Berlin, but rather Berlin as a starting point, and she makes her own life then in London. Thank you very much.